Sorrow is a sign that God remembers us, that He is working with us, like a sculptor with stone, cutting away the excess with hammer blows to reveal a beautiful image. In the end, it is sorrows that make us more human. A sculptor does not add anything to the marble to create the figure inside it. He removes everything that isn't the figure, chip by chip, blow by blow, until what was always hidden inside the stone finally becomes visible. Saint Paisios is suggesting something genuinely difficult to accept in the moment of suffering itself. That sorrow might not simply be damage. It might be a kind of removal, cutting away whatever stands between a person and who they actually are underneath. This is not a comfortable idea, and it would be dishonest to pretend it always feels true while the hammer is still falling. But across psychology, philosophy, and centuries of spiritual writing that never once cited one another, a strikingly similar claim keeps resurfacing, described in strikingly different language each time. Viktor Frankl's account of survival in the Nazi concentration camps offers one of the clearest psychological parallels to Paisios' sculptor image. Frankl did not romanticize the suffering he witnessed. He was explicit that the camps destroyed people physically and psychologically, and that suffering alone guarantees nothing. But Frankl noticed something specific among the prisoners who endured longest with their inner selves intact. They were not the ones who avoided confronting their suffering, but the ones who found some way to assign it meaning rather than experiencing it as pure, senseless destruction. He describes one prisoner who, facing near certain death, chose to spend his final days quietly comforting others in the barracks rather than withdrawing into despair, a decision Frankl presents not as denial of the horror around him, but as a final, deliberate assertion of who he still chose to be inside it. Frankl described this general capacity as the ability to transform even unavoidable suffering into an achievement, if the person facing it chooses their inner attitude toward it deliberately rather than simply being erased by it. In some ways, suffering ceases to be suffering at the moment it finds a meaning. This is not identical to Paisios' claim, but it rhymes with it closely. Frankl is not saying suffering is good. He is saying that suffering, engaged with consciously rather than merely absorbed, can become material for something: dignity, depth, clarity about what actually matters, that comfort alone rarely produces on its own. In the 1990s, psychologists Richard Tedeschi and Lawrence Calhoun coined a term for something clinicians had long observed anecdotally but never rigorously studied: post-traumatic growth, describing positive psychological change that some people experience specifically as a result of struggling with highly challenging, traumatic life events, not merely in spite of them. Their research identified several recurring areas where trauma survivors reported genuine growth: a deepened sense of personal strength, discovered specifically through surviving what once seemed unsurvivable; more meaningful and authentic relationships, often because adversity clarified who truly mattered; a changed and often deepened sense of life priorities; and in many cases, a renewed engagement with spiritual or existential questions that had gone unexamined before the crisis. It's worth being precise about what this research does and doesn't claim. Tedeschi and Calhoun were careful to state that trauma does not automatically produce growth, that suffering and growth typically coexist rather than one simply replacing the other, and that plenty of trauma produces only damage, particularly without adequate support. Post-traumatic growth is a documented possibility, not a guarantee, and researchers in the field have cautioned against using it to pressure suffering people into performing recovery on an accelerated timeline. But the documented cases are real, and they land remarkably close to Paisios' image. People describe, in their own words, a sense that adversity stripped away illusions they had been carrying about their own invulnerability, about what actually mattered, about relationships that turned out to be shallow once tested, leaving something they experience as more solid, more honest, standing in what was cleared away. Carl Jung's model of individuation offers a related, more psychologically mechanical explanation for why this pattern might occur. Jung believed a person cannot become whole by avoiding their own darkness, the parts of the psyche and of life that are difficult, painful, or frightening. Genuine wholeness, in Jung's framework, requires direct confrontation with exactly the material a person would most prefer to avoid. The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. Jung observed clinically that patients who avoided their pain, distracting themselves from it indefinitely, tended to remain fragmented, running from an ever-growing portion of their own experience. Patients who faced their suffering directly, grief, trauma, shame often emerged from that confrontation with a psyche that had, in some sense, been forced to integrate parts of itself it had previously kept walled off. The suffering did not feel good in the moment, and Jung never suggested it should. But the confrontation it forced tended to produce exactly the kind of integration his entire model of psychological health was built around. This maps onto the sculptor image with unusual precision. Jung's psyche, like Paisios' stone, contains something whole already, obscured by material that has to be confronted and worked through, not added to, but cleared away, before it can be seen. The Stoics approach the same territory from a different direction, focused more on how a person should actively relate to hardship while it is happening. Marcus Aurelius, writing privately in his meditations, returned repeatedly to a version of the same idea. The impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way. For Marcus, obstacles were not simply things to be endured until they passed. They were the actual material a person's character was built from. There was, in his view, no other raw material available for practicing courage, patience, or discipline besides the specific difficulties a person actually encountered. A life with no obstacles would be a life with no opportunity to develop any of the virtues the Stoics considered most valuable. Seneca made a related, sharper claim in his writing on hardship. That difficulty was not a sign of divine neglect, but closer to the opposite, evidence that a person was being tested precisely because they were considered capable of rising to it, the way a skilled trainer gives the hardest opponents to the strongest athletes, not the weakest. This is strikingly close to Paisios' claim that sorrow is a sign of being remembered, worked on, rather than abandoned, arrived at independently, centuries earlier, from an entirely different spiritual framework. The 20th century philosopher and mystic Simone Weil offers one of the most demanding treatments of suffering in this entire tradition, precisely because she refused to soften it. Weil drew a careful distinction between ordinary suffering and what she called affliction, a more totalizing form of anguish that attacks a person physically, psychologically, and socially all at once, often stripping away dignity itself, not merely comfort. Will did not claim affliction was good or that it should be sought. She was explicit that affliction can also simply crush a person, producing nothing but degradation, and she refused to romanticize suffering the way some spiritual writing does. But she argued that affliction, faced with total honesty rather than denial or bitterness, could become one of the few experiences capable of breaking open a person's illusions about their own self-sufficiency, completely enough to let something greater than the self enter in. Most people go through life protected by comfort from ever fully confronting their own smallness and dependency, and affliction, when survived with attention rather than collapse, can remove that protection entirely. Weil's account is the least comforting of anyone in this video, and deliberately so. She does not promise growth. She describes a door that affliction sometimes opens without guaranteeing what walks through it, or that the person survives the opening intact. Her honesty on this point is worth sitting with rather than smoothing over. Nietzsche, characteristically, pushed the claim further and more provocatively than any of the others. He was openly contemptuous of what he considered a shallow, comfort-obsessed modern culture, and argued that genuine depth of character, real wisdom, real strength, real art, has historically required suffering that a purely comfortable life could never produce. Whatever does not kill us makes us stronger. The line has become a cliché, printed on gym walls until its edge has dulled, but in Nietzsche's original context, it carried real philosophical weight. Nietzsche believed comfort, pursued as the primary goal of life, tended to produce shallow, undifferentiated people, what he called the last man, while difficulty, faced and metabolized rather than avoided, was the actual forge most great human achievement, and character had historically been built inside. He was not arguing that suffering should be sought recklessly, and his own life, marked by significant physical and psychological illness, was hardly an advertisement for suffering's automatic benefits. But his claim, stripped down, converges again with Paisios' Sculptor. Something in comfort alone cannot produce what difficulty, faced directly, sometimes can. It would be irresponsible to end this video without naming something several of these thinkers, especially Weil and Frankl, were careful about themselves. Telling a suffering person in the middle of their suffering that it will make them stronger or more beautiful is frequently not comfort. It can be its own kind of cruelty, minimizing what someone is currently enduring in service of a lesson they haven't asked for and may never want. Frankl himself resisted turning his philosophy into a demand. He was explicit that meaning has to be found by the person suffering in their own time, through their own reckoning, not handed to them by an observer standing safely outside the suffering itself. Will refuse to promise growth at all. What all of these thinkers actually offer is not a formula to apply to someone else's pain, but a possibility available, eventually, often only in retrospect, to the person who lived through it, and even then, never guaranteed. Paisios' Sculptor does not explain the pain of every hammer blow, and nothing in this video is meant to. But perhaps that is the most honest way to hold the image, not as an answer to why suffering happens, but as a possibility for what it can sometimes leave behind, chip by chip, blow by blow, until whatever was always underneath the stone finally has room enough to be seen and finally shine.